2 summers ago in 2019, before the world wanted to come to an end. I was invited to teach social entrepreneurship at Stanford, or a 3-week intensive. And Lisa and the people at Lyft were nice enough to allow my class to come to Lyft. And we got a tour of Lyft. And during that tour, we got Lisa gave a magnificent talk about corporate social responsibility. And she's the director of social impact. Is that your correct title?
Yeah.
Director of social impact at Lyft. Since then, during during Startup Week, she came and gave a presentation when we were all still allowed to meet together at the Jim Moran building. And she was kind enough to join our class today and give this talk. So it's actually, if I could have everybody turn on their screens, it's a lot easier for a speaker to be able to see your faces instead of just names, so they don't think they're just speaking into oblivion. I've done enough of these that it makes it really challenging. So yeah, I appreciate it if you do turn on your cameras. That's great. So I know you guys didn't come here to listen to me. You came here to hear Lisa. So everybody welcome Lisa Boyd of Lyft.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Take it away, Lisa.
Thanks so much for having me, and I agree, it's nice to not talk and to avoid. Great to see all of your faces. Before I dive in, I'll just give you a quick overview of kind of my background and how I ended up where I am. And then I'll talk you through probably like 15 to 20 minutes of high level about both what my team does at Lyft and what it means to do social impact at Lyft. And then more broadly, looking at the social impact sector, the corporate responsibility and ESG sector, with some trends and things that I think y'all should be aware of. And then I'll leave a good amount of time to chat and answer any questions that you might have. So with that said, my journey to Lyft has been admittedly all over the place and a very winding path. I started in international development. I studied international relations at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. Through that, I got really into particularly water and sanitation in the developing world and how those systems could be more transparent and sustainable over time. So during and after school, I spent about 3 years in Tanzania and then Malawi doing community level and district level water and sanitation work. And then for many personal reasons, decided that I wanted to move back to the US and really focus on social issues here at home, which there are obviously plenty of. I wanted to make an impact closer to home. So I moved to New York and I actually got into the world of social impact consulting. So I spent about 5 years in New York working with nonprofits and for-profits who were engaging, in particular, young people around social impact and actions that they could take in their community. I actually, if any of you are familiar with DoSomething.org, which is a very large youth volunteering organization, I started and built their consulting arm, which kind of used all of DoSomething's expertise in working with companies and nonprofits to activate young people. From there, I decided again, for personal reasons, I really needed some more nature in my life. New York is wonderful, but very much a concrete jungle. And so I decided to move out to the West Coast, and I landed at a small nonprofit called Pledge 1% that's really focused on getting early stage startups to think about how they can integrate giving back into their work from day one. So Pledge 1% helps companies give back 1% of their equity, profit, product, or staff time to any social causes they want. So it's kind of like I was doing light touch consulting again with lots and lots of small companies to help them figure out how they could do this and how they could really get it baked into the DNA of their companies. And through my work at Pledge 1%, I happened to get connected to the guy who was tapped to be the first head of social impact at Lyft a couple of years ago. So Lyft has been doing social impact from the very, very beginning because our co-founders are very socially focused and driven. But we officially started a team just about 3 years ago And I joined shortly after that to help start and build that team. So I've now been at Lyft for about 2.5 years. The guy who I was referring to has since left, and I'm now leading the team. And it's, for me, a dream job in the way that we're able to make impact and to really harness the resources that Lyft has. So with that said, let me dive into telling you a little bit more about what we do. Just going to share my screen really quick. All right, can you all see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Wanted to distract you with some animations that are more interesting than my face. So to dive into the what we do at Lyft and our commitment to really leading with values and commitment to impact, I first want to start with our mission statement. So it's important to note that this is not Lyft's social impact mission statement. This is our company mission statement. Our company mission statement has and always will be tied to really helping people. So we are focused on improving people's lives with the world's best transportation. And that's what we call our why, like the why in our name, and the why we do the work that we do. And when we think about how we act then in the community in terms of our social impact programs, that means we're really leaning into transportation. So we're not just making cash grants or doing volunteering or things that many other companies can do. We're leaning into what's unique to Lyft. So the work that I lead is our Lyft Up program, which is a comprehensive effort to expand transportation access to communities in need. So we're really focused on where transportation, a ride, whether that is a car ride or a bike or scooter ride. Y'all might not know this, but we are actually the largest bike share provider across the country. So we run City Bike in New York, Divvy Bike in Chicago, Bay Wheels in the Bay Area, etc. We also have scooters in a ton of markets, those electric scooters that you've probably seen. So through that, we're really focused on all of those modes of transportation and how can we use those in the right circumstances to make a really strong impact. So that looks like these are a few of our biggest programs and our core programs that we lean into, but they're not our only programs. But as you'll see on here, we're really focused on specific communities and specific use cases where transportation can make an impact. So we have a major food access program where we're focused at, pre-COVID, we were focused on getting people who lived in food insecure areas to the grocery store. Now, in light of COVID and all of the changes that have happened, we've actually leaned heavily into food delivery, and we are now helping get food to the doorsteps of people who need it most, in particular seniors and low-income families whose children usually rely on free and reduced lunch but are out of school right now. We're also focused on jobs access, so helping, again, super relevant right now, but we're helping people get to and from a job interview, a job training, or the first few weeks of work until they have enough cash in their pocket to pay for their own transportation moving forward. We also have a huge voting access program that's live right now. So if you need a ride to the polls on election day, you can get 50% off your ride to the polls as anyone across the country. And then we're also providing free rides to communities who need it most. So we're working with nonprofits that service Black and Brown communities, seniors, veterans, et cetera, who traditionally have more trouble getting to the polls to ensure that we're increasing access for everybody. We also have a huge disaster response program. So in the wake of disasters, we're often not activating in the middle of a hurricane or fires or anything because we want to make sure that our drivers are safe first and foremost. But especially in the aftermath, when we're doing recovery work, we're partnered with many organizations like World Central Kitchen and Team Rubicon, who are out there doing disaster response work and helping to rebuild. And they're providing those rides to community members who need to get around or for their staff to be able to get around. We also have a bike share access program. As I mentioned, we have bikes all over the country. And in particular, we're focused on youth age 16 to 20 for that program. We launched a program earlier this year with the YMCA and LeBron James. LeBron has been a huge advocate for bikes and the impact that bikes have had on his life in terms of enabling him to get around. And so that's kind of an ethos that we're trying to spread to other young people who need that access to transportation. And lastly, we have a community grants program. which is an initiative that basically helps all other use cases, and in particular, hyper-local nonprofits who have specific use cases for their communities. So with this, we're supporting these very small organizations who are doing on-the-ground work, whether that be supporting people experiencing homelessness to get to a shelter, or victims of domestic violence to get to a safe space. There's so many different uses where transportation can make an impact that are relevant to the specific local circumstances of any given city. So we're really leaning into those local nonprofits to tell us what they need, and so we can fill gaps on those needs. So when we think about all of these programs, it's always important to remember that, my role is to make an impact, but also we are a for-profit company. So we need to be simultaneously thinking about the social impact of the work that we do, as well as the business impact. So when we set goals, both for the individual programs I was talking about, as well as a whole for our team, we're kind of thinking on both ends of this spectrum. On the social impact side, we're talking about kind of two different sections. And you may have heard about this terminology before, but there's a distinction, especially in the nonprofit community, between outputs versus outcomes. Outputs are the immediate results that you create through a program. So for us, that means the number of rides we've donated, the number of meals we've delivered, the number of people we've served. Those are important in immediate indicators of the impact, but it doesn't necessarily indicate the long-term impact that you're trying to make. There are a lot of assumptions made when you're creating a program about the long-term impact, but it's much tougher to actually measure those those outcomes in the long term. So in addition to measuring, the number of rides or meals or whatnot that we're providing, we are also looking at the long-term outcomes. So we're working with third-party research entities to measure, how many people did we actually get jobs, and what was the incremental difference in them being able to keep those jobs because they had transportation. Or for somebody who we got to the grocery store over a period of 6 months, what was the actual impact on their health as a result of that? And therefore, was the transportation that important to them? So we're still in the earlier stages of measuring these outcomes together with third parties. And I will say that COVID threw a bit of a wrench in some of those plans this year. But we're thinking about both of those, and it's really important to think on both scales. And then on the business impact side, we at Lyft have a ton of different stakeholders, and the stakeholder list is going to look different at any company you work for or any company you talk to. But we have very, very clearly defined these 6 stakeholder groups listed here as the ones that are most important to us in terms of messaging out the social impact and community work that we do. So my job, in addition to kind of building these positive programs and ensuring that they have those strong outputs and outcomes, is making sure that I'm communicating properly about those programs to all the necessary teams within Lyft who communicate with our policymakers who regulate Lyft, riders who could choose us over our competition because of our values, drivers, the same reason, our Lyft business clients, which are B2B clients, like big businesses who pay for employee travel, for example. Those companies who care about values as well might choose us over competition because of that values alignment. Our employees, one of the top reasons why people come to Lyft is because of our mission and the work that we do, and the programs like our voting access work. And so we need to continue to communicate that to our employees to keep them excited about the work that we're doing and really proud to be here. And lastly, an important one, since we're a public company, is our investors. And we'll talk a little bit more about investors when we get into the broader corporate responsibility section. But it's important to note that most of my team's work is around our Lift Up programs, which are like philanthropic programs. But there is much more to social impact. And in particular, I'll talk in a second about the difference between social impact and ESG, environmental, social, and governance, as kind of different tiers of this work. So it's important to know that there's a lot more happening at Lyft outside of just the philanthropic programs that my team runs. So we have, for example, a commitment to become 100% EVs within our fleet by 2030. it's a huge commitment and we have a lot of work to do on it, but we have a whole sustainability team who is thinking about both the tactical operations and implementation of that, as well as how policy might help us to reach that goal. We also have a huge team focused on inclusion and diversity within Lyft, on our employee resource groups to make people feel welcome and included at Lyft. We also have a whole product team who is focused on things like Round Up and Donate, which you see in the top right corner here. That's a really well-known product that we have where on any ride, you can round up your remaining cents to the nearest dollar and donate that to a nonprofit. I actually don't have any involvement in that aside from occasionally helping to vet the nonprofits that we're adding to the program. It's run by our product team. And I think it's really important to think about where there's impact across the whole company versus just kind of the philanthropic efforts that we're doing. So with that said, I'm going to transition into kind of the broader take on CSR that I think is relevant for you all to keep in mind as you're thinking about business as a whole and about the future of corporate responsibility. And we can come back and at the end, I'll take questions on whatever you all have them on. So as I was just saying, I think there's kind of two different ways or two different levels of thinking about corporate responsibility. Social impact and the traditional corporate social responsibility is philanthropic work that's kind of a side bubble or a silo within the broader company. ESG, which I think you've heard this term before, hopefully, but environmental, social, and governance is really a broader framework that applies to the entire company. So what it's doing is helping to push beyond just the philanthropic work into what do you stand for as a company as a whole, and how are you continuing to live up to your values at a macro level. This is really important because I think if you look at corporate responsibility in the past, especially with very kind of old school, big companies, you tend to have business practices on one side that are maybe not very good. And then you have CSR on the other side that's kind of covering up for all of the bad work done on the other hand. And it's not a comprehensive way to think about business. So it's important that we're thinking bigger picture. And that's where this trend with ESG has really come in. And it's a really exciting one. And so although my team is really focused on what you would call CSR, like that social impact, those philanthropic programs, I have a much wider purview where we help cross-functionally to push the company on our values. So our environmental, social, and governance report that we put out for the first time this year, since we just went public, it's usually something that public companies put out. I helped to write that report and was really instrumental in spearheading that because I see my role as really helping to drive the whole company as being values driven. With ESG, I think an important thing to flag is that part of the reason why you're hearing more about this and you're seeing more of it in the traditional business world is actually because it's coming from the investor side. So as happens in capitalism, you got to follow the money, and the money is coming from these big institutional investors. And BlackRock has been a leader in really pushing the sector in the last 5-10 years. In particular, Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock, and he has twice in the last 5 to 10 years written his annual letter to CEOs saying, as an investor in your company, I care about your sustainability, I care about your social practices, I care about what you do as a company beyond just your profits. And that's really important because companies are held to fiduciary standards where you're basically incentivized to maximize profit as much as possible. And it's by investors and by your boards. And it's really important to see this shift where investors are saying it's not just okay, it is good for you to invest in things beyond just making profit. You need to think about the overall health and impacts of your business. So there are kind of, as I've said, there's two different levels, but I think within that, there's so many moving pieces and different ways that people define corporate responsibility, social impact, ESG. And I think it's really, really important for you all to know as you're thinking about this, because it is still an ambiguous and slightly messy term. So many people use these terms to describe very different types of work. It's kind of like saying all of this is, like saying everything in marketing is the same, when in reality, within a marketing org, one person might be doing Google AdWords, one person might be doing creative design. They're all very different types of roles and types of projects that ladder up to this. So with that said, I think there's a whole bunch that goes under broader environmental, social, and governance. These 3 bullets are not everything by any means. Feel free to look at our 80-page ESG report to get a sense of everything that is encompassed in ESG. But I think some examples of things that you might not think about are your supply chain transparency. So, you've probably all heard this with companies like Nike or Gap or H&M, or people who are doing a lot of products, but where they are sourcing those products, what is the environmental impacts, who is making those products, how well are they paid, what are the conditions they're working in. That's a really big one. Less so for a company like Lyft that doesn't produce, but a very big one in the ESG space. Data privacy and security is another huge one that you might not think about, but is really, really important for companies to be reporting out on. And one that's probably a little bit more top of mind for y'all is understanding employee inclusion and diversity practices. What are your hiring pipelines looking like? How much diversity do you have in your leadership? So again, these are not everything. There's so much more under ESG because it's comprehensive across the company. But I think it's important to note that there are lots of things in here that maybe you don't think of as social impact, but they have an impact from that company onto the world in the way that they act. And then there's the buckets of kind of social impact programming, which is a little closer to the work that I'm doing. So these are the more philanthropic efforts. And even within that, there's a huge diversity in what people are talking about. Some companies are really, really focused on employee engagement and giving. So that means getting their employee base to volunteer, to donate to organizations. They're trying to meet fundraising goals, for example. If you worked in a role like that, it's actually a lot of like event planning and engaging with groups and whatnot. Whereas kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum, there are other companies who are really focused on grant making and actually making donations direct to nonprofits. Working at an organization doing that type of work is almost more like working at a traditional foundation than it is like working, in my role. So I think it's important to think about the differences in these and the way that they impact the world, but also the way those careers could look. The third on this is product and service donation, which is how I define Lyft's work. We are donating our product and our service to support communities in need. Environmental sustainability, this is often bucketed under social impact, but actually many times there's a different team working on it since the skill sets for this are very different. So at Lyft, we have both our social impact team as well as a separate sustainability team. And lastly, I think one that's worth calling out is brand advocacy and cause marketing. And this is probably the one that you all are actually most familiar with because you're seeing companies, put out advertisements and put out social media content and whatnot, talking about their stances. In particular, over the last few months, in the wake of the George Floyd protests, there have been a lot of stances, for example, on Black Lives Matter and anti-racism. Some of those organizations actually have tangible work behind those statements, and others are just making statements. And I think there's an important distinction between standing up and using your voice and the power that that can have as a business, and making sure that companies have real substance behind those commitments and that they're actually doing something behind the scenes and they're not just putting up a facade of it. So a few interesting examples in that kind of brand advocacy and cause marketing world. One is REI. If you may not have heard of this campaign, REI every Black Friday for the past, I think 4 or 5 years, has done a campaign called Opt Outside, where they really encourage people, instead of taking part in Black Friday, which has a lot of challenges to it, they instead encourage people to get outside on that day, which is really in line with their mission and their vision as an outdoors company. But they didn't just do this as a marketing campaign. They actually closed all of their stores on Black Friday and paid their employees to not come to work. So that's taking something from an ad campaign into an actual action that's making impact. On the right, you have a recent post from Ben & Jerry's about defunding the police. Ben & Jerry's is a classic example of a company who has earned the right to make strong statements on many different issues because they are consistently active and they're doing a ton around policy engagement. They're doing a ton around donations to organizations. They have been active for a very long time in the social impact space. So they've earned the right to talk about things that many other companies can't do. And the last example that I like is Dick's Sporting Goods, who in the wake of the Parkland shooting decided to stop carrying guns, which was a huge hit to their revenue by doing so, but was a moral decision to make. And that's a good example of something that is, yes, it is, they use this to storytell and to get PR and get brand awareness, but they also took a strong statement and an actual action that hit their bottom line in a tangible way. And that's a really meaningful way to think about the impact that you can have. And I think that the thing that kind of pulls through on all of these, most importantly, is authenticity and being real. You can see through when companies are doing it for their brand value, to try to sway you, to try to make you think that they are socially focused, but you can often see when there's not substance behind it. And so I think the core in all of this is making sure that the work is authentic and that it's real and that it's substantive. So I want to kind of finish out by talking a little bit about if you are interested in working in corporate responsibility. I'd be happy to chat with anyone if so, but there are a couple different things that I would say to think about as you're thinking about CSR as a field. I will first caveat that it's still a very new field and the jobs and the roles are changing and there aren't that many of them, which makes it a little bit complex to navigate as a field. But one thing to consider is what the company's kind of model of social change is or their theory of change. So that gets back to what I was noting earlier about, are they focused on engaging their employees? Are they focused on grants or product donations? Different ones of those programs might inspire and excite you more than others. So just thinking about what types of work you're proud of and you'd be excited to take part in is a good starting point to understand, how to kind of cut the different job opportunities into things you may or may not be excited about. Another thing to consider if you are looking at the kind of product side of things is one thing that drove me to Lyft was the fact that our product and service is impactful in its own right without even any philanthropic work. So for example, I lived in New York for many years, as I mentioned, and many of the outer boroughs of New York, particularly lower income neighborhoods, never had access to taxis before. Taxis did not go to those areas, and there was a real lack of access to necessary transportation. And rideshare changed that in a lot of ways. There was a great op-ed from our previous head of our policy org, the org that the team that I am part of, where he talked about how as a Black man, he had consistently been passed over by taxis in the past, and rideshare really was a game changer for him in being able to access transportation. And that underlying value of the product and service and making an impact on the world was what drove me to Lyft just as much as the opportunity to do social impact work itself. Another thing that I think people don't consider enough, and this is whether or not you're going into corporate responsibility specifically, is what's the size of the company? There is such a different feel between a startup where you're wearing a million hats, doing a million jobs, but you don't have a ton of oversight or guidance, versus a bigger company where you maybe have a lot of mentorship and support, but it's much more structured and you have kind of a clear lane to play in. They're just very different and both have pros and cons. So I'd urge you to think about what type of working environment inspires and excites you. What is the stage of social impact programming? Again, another thing that brought me to Lyft was the fact that I could be early on the team to help develop that program rather than coming into a formulated program that had been around for years where I was just kind of picking up where someone else left off. And lastly, and most importantly, do you have leadership buy-in and proof that the company really is committed to impact? Lyft's co-founders have been doing social impact from day one. They are good people and they genuinely care about this. And that is the reason why we as a company can do so much and why my team can do so much. I don't have to fight an uphill battle every day. And that's not the case everywhere, unfortunately, but it is something to consider in terms of what type of company do you want to work for and where might you find leaders who really inspire you and align with your values. And the last thing I'll say before we kind of wrap up and go do questions is, even if you think you might be excited about CSR, I would push you to say you don't need a corporate responsibility, social impact, ESG title to make an impact. There are so many companies out there who, again, the underlying work that they do is impactful in a positive way on the world. There are benefit corporations, B Corps, who are set up to make an impact directly, like Propel, if you haven't heard of them, are a really incredible company who built an app for people to better access EBT, which are food stamps and food access. Like different jobs that they can then be hired by US companies and make it a living wage. Newman's Own, the pasta company, you might not even know this, but they donate 100% of their proceeds to nonprofits. You have like mental health organizations, you have outdoor gear organizations. There are so many different companies, depending on what your passions are. Like think about if you care about health, if you care about, anything, animals, whatever it is, you can find a company probably who has a tangible impact on the issue that you care about. And then you could work at that company in marketing or software development or literally anything because you're tying up to that mission that you're excited about and proud of. So I just challenge you to think more broadly about the impact that companies have and where you could be excited to work. So with that, I will stop and take questions.
Awesome.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, firstly, thank you for like speaking. That was like really nice. What caught my attention is that you guys like split everything into like teams, right? So like, do you guys ever come together like different teams to like work on a goal, or everybody works on like a separate goal to like achieve something?
Both. So sometimes we have projects that are very cross-functional. So we might have, a team from marketing and a team from communications and a team from product and a team from policy who are all working together on one collective goal because it ladders up to each of their respective teams' goals. But at the higher level, across like the ESG framework that I was talking about, like data privacy is a good example. Data privacy never overlaps with my world. Our jobs are very different. The goals that team has are very different than the goals that I have on my team. So we never really overlap, but that doesn't mean that the work that we're each doing doesn't kind of ladder up to the same big picture goal of making our company as values driven as possible. So there are definitely places where we collaborate really closely. And in particular, my role, I work with dozens of teams on a regular basis. So I do work very cross-functionally, but most companies plan on like a team by team basis where you have your kind of specific objectives for your team. So you just have to make sure that you're kind of laddering up to everybody's respective goals.
Thank you.
So Lisa, there's a bunch of questions in chat, and then on a spreadsheet, I have about maybe 50 plus questions. I'm not sure how to best. I would say like there's probably about 20 questions about COVID, but I don't know if that's necessarily on topic unless you have something you would like to talk about COVID. Sorry, and
I can just, no, you're good.
Cameras here, our computer's going.
I'll answer real quick about what we did for COVID, and then you can maybe parse through which ones seem most exciting for the group. But COVID threw everything apart as it did for you. And as Mark was saying, your class was supposed to be in person, now it's online. I think, it has changed our programs. So as I mentioned, the biggest difference is that we're now doing delivery. When you think of Lyft as an app, you've never ordered delivery through the app, and we're not actually doing it direct to consumer. We work with nonprofit and government partners to do that delivery, but that's a really new space for us. So we launched basically a whole new line of business with delivery. We partnered with nonprofits and governments to do that food delivery. There's lots of logistics in that. So that was a really important learning. And that came about because we listened to our community. We were, talking to people as soon as COVID hit about what they needed. And we had this huge list of partners that we were already working with. And so many of them overnight were coming back to us and we're like, we need to figure out how to get food to people's doors. We were like, oh God, okay, never done that before. Like, let's figure it out. But we were really responding to what was coming in at us as those asks. And I think what's really important with that is that we have built relationships with many, many nonprofits. We probably partner with hundreds, if not thousands of nonprofits across the country. And so those close existing relationships mean that when something like COVID hits, we can respond quickly because we hear what is needed from the community. I think the other real thing is just that it totally changed the way we planned. Usually I have a 6-month or a full year plan of everything we're going to execute. All of that got thrown out the window. And right now we're kind of planning on a monthly basis of what we're able to do given what's happening in the world. So that's been a very, very different way that we think about kind of team management and planning our projects.
Great. Anna McGee, I think you have a really interesting question. That's a tough question, Lisa. So get ready for this one, I think. You want to ask it, Anna?
I was just asking, what are some examples of actions that you took in order to reach racist efforts and stuff?
Sorry, just so I understand, to respond to the last few months of the broader conversation around racism? Yeah, it's a great question. We have 2 different sets of programs that we're running right now. Many of these were already in the works, although we've kind of ramped up and added new things based off of feedback from our employees and communities over the last few months. So on the internal side, we're really focused on employee engagement and support and what it is like to work at Lyft. So one thing that we've launched recently is a sponsorship program and a mentorship program. So the difference between those two is mentorship is more about coaching and supporting somebody with specific problems. And sponsorship is actually more about speaking up to advocate for those people to be, promoted or in the right rooms. And so we have a new sponsorship program for, a specific level employee for all Black and Latinx employees. And we have a mentorship program now for more junior employees. So those are both new programs that we've launched, and we've doubled down on other things internally, like our recruiting efforts, specifically at the executive level, to ensure that we're filling roles. We already have filling roles effectively. We already have some, I won't get into all of the hiring practice details, but there's a lot in the works, and basically we've kind of improved and built upon that. On the external side, similarly, we were working with many organizations already and have been for years on programs that support Black and Latinx communities specifically, as well as kind of broader communities of color. In the last few months, we have kind of built stronger and larger partnerships with those groups. So when we did our voting access work back in 2018, National Urban League was one of our core partners there. We have, in addition, this year added other partners like National Action Network, Black Women's Roundtable. We partnered last time with Voto Latino, but this time we've also added LULAC, which is another major organization supporting the Latinx community. So what we're doing is just kind of adding partners in a more strategic way and continuing to invest in those partners. And in addition, one thing that my team is actually working on right now is our jobs access work, grocery access work, and others have always and will continue to support communities of color at scale. However, those programs weren't specifically defined or specifically created to address issues that have been caused by systemic racism in America. And so what we're trying to do right now is say, what are the issues where racism has directly caused inequities? And are there ways where transportation might be able to help start to minimize those inequities? So in particular, based off of research that we've done already, we've identified housing, criminal justice, and the education system, in particular kind of community college and college access, because we can't put anyone under 18 in a Lyft by themselves legally. Those 3 areas are places that we've been really thinking about, and we're actually in talks with a ton of our partners right now about what are the specific ways where transportation might be able to help with, you know, appointments for bail, for example, or appointments for affordable housing, or certain ways where we might be able to directly affect where racism has created these inequities. And so that's kind of the longer term of what we're doing. But I will say, like, across the board, Lyft has been doing this. So maybe you haven't heard it because we haven't talked a ton about it, but we weren't starting from scratch in the last few months. Like, these aren't new issues, obviously, and they're not things that Lyft just came to the table about.
That's great. Thank you, Lisa. There's lots of great questions. I'm trying to kind of like read through them and kind of like figure out like if there's any themes happening. Caroline Stein, I think, has a good question. Caroline, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so you kind of touched on some companies say they're promoting social impacts, but they're not really working like to actually do that. So how can customers recognize these companies?
It's a good question. I think, so there were a couple of questions actually that I see about marketing, and I think these kind of tie together. It is hard to market social impact because when you market it and you toot your own horn, it feels inauthentic. And and then many of the companies who are really doing that storytelling aren't doing much behind it. So the marketing aspect of social impact of corporate social responsibility and social impact is very hard. It's complex. A lot of people have not nailed it yet. I will say, like, trying to think of some concrete examples, but if you look back at like the Super Bowl, there were like all sorts of Super Bowl ads where it was like, here's this beautiful story about like racism in America, buy a truck. And you're like, what? Like none of that ties together. There was no action. There's no website talking about the work that they're doing. There is no program behind it. There's no thought behind it. They wanted to inspire you and tap into a cultural conversation, but they didn't want to actually do the work. And so I think being cognizant that if a company is doing real work, you should be able to, you know, there should be a real like website at the end of a, you know, an ad that you're seeing that points you to somewhere that they tell you the actual details of the work that they're doing, and there's substance and there's data, or there's like a plan laid out of what they're actually going to do. You know, if you go to lyft.com/liftup, it lays out like a bazillion programs that we're doing and like the organizations we're partnered with and what that looks like and how you can join and, you know, take part in those programs. And I think what you need to do is do the homework on the ones that you might be skeptical of, because if you can't find any information on what they're actually doing, then there's a good chance they're not doing anything, and it was kind of just a storytelling narrative that they wanted to lean into.
Yeah, and just to let you know, Lisa, we really haven't got into greenwashing yet in the class. We'll definitely get into that. And actually, the second part of the class is all about reporting and what you report and what companies are reporting. And this is just, I think you said it, but I know you did a ESG or a sustainability report. Did you use GRI?
No. So is there any context, or should I give some more?
They know nothing about it. I'm just wondering because
Okay.
we're going to be diving into these reports.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if what did you use and why?
Yeah, so the ESG space is, as I was alluding to, pretty new. And as happens in new sectors within within the corporate world, there is no consistency. So I spent the last like year and a half going to conferences and asking people questions and trying to understand what the frameworks were. And my key takeaway is everyone does it differently and there is no consistency. But I am hoping that we're moving in the direction of more consistency. The biggest frameworks that people often talk about, which I think you'll dive into, are SASB, GRI, are the kind of biggest ones. And then smaller companies tend to do, and smaller and not public companies tend to do the B Corp certification. The biggest difference is that GRI is actually mostly for international, most of the companies doing it are international, because guidelines around reporting, particularly around things like data and privacy, are very strict in Europe. And so GRI is built around European standards. So any company that functions globally is actually already doing that type of reporting. And so GRI is kind of a more comprehensive reporting structure. We are not international, and we are still a young company. We only went public last year. We're still a startup in many ways. So we don't have the technical tracking systems internally yet to do the level of reporting of GRI. I hope to get us there, but we leaned more into the SASB structures, which are a little bit simpler. And one thing that's really interesting is, as I was alluding to in the presentation, different companies have different things that they need to report on, because every company's potential impacts on the environment or society are very different. So again, like if you're producing goods, you have very different impact. You need to think about supply chains. If you are a online company, you maybe are thinking about your cloud storage and what are the environmental impacts of your cloud storage, or what are your data privacy rules. So Lyft is a really interesting scenario because there is actually no SASB framework around what we are, which is a what's called a TNC, a transportation network company. And so we are simultaneously kind of defined as a tech company and kind of defined as a transportation company, but neither of them is fully accurate. So we did a weird mishmash of the different frameworks to be able to report as best we could on what was relevant and most impactful for our company.
Great, thank you. And I wanted just to touch on that, because after we're done with our systems mapping, we're getting into ESG reporting. So you guys will learn a lot more about that. I think we have time for one more question, Lisa. Is that okay?
Sure.
And then maybe you can close us out with some inspiring thoughts.
Sure.
If you have a really interesting question, you want to ask it? Or maybe I'll ask it for you. Alex? No, Alex. Okay, well, I'll ask. As a brand, oh, there you are.
I'm sorry. Are you talking about the one I put in the chat?
I didn't see the one on the chat. They were scrolling. I was looking on the one that you put on my Google Doc, attracting investors who care about ESG.
Oh, I didn't write that one. Someone else put that there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, Lisa, you want to answer that?
So sorry, can you read the question again? How do we attract investors that care about ESG?
Basically, so we're a college of entrepreneurs. So one of the big questions is how much do investors care about social impact and sustainability, and how has Lyft gone about positioning themselves to attract those type of investors?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me first start by saying there's two very different types of investors, and I should have clarified this sooner. There are venture capital investors, which are if you were to start a business tomorrow and you wanted VC funding to kind of get your business off the ground. Those are the folks that are helping you in the early days. And so that's kind of the VC world, venture capital world, is one aspect of investors. The other are, once you are a public company like Lyft is, we have more institutional investors who actually buy our shares or stock online, or are buying our stock and holding pieces of our company because we're public. So let me start on the VC side. I think that world is changing more slowly than the institutional investor side, to be totally transparent. So I think most VCs are still looking for return on their investment and financial returns. I do think there is strong proof that mission ties to financial returns, whether that be attracting talent. It's a major reason why people come to work at certain companies. It's really important for attracting potential customers, potential business clients. So I think making your case around why you care about social impact, but how that's actually going to help the business bottom line, as I was talking about, like, here are key audiences that we care about, that care about social impact. That's the way you should be thinking about it in terms of messaging to a venture capital group or someone who's an early stage investor. When you're talking about later stage investors, the part of the trend, which is interesting, again, obviously we're talking business, so it is money driven, but there has been a lot in the last few years of companies kind of screwing themselves by making these social and environmental missteps. So, you have everything from like oil companies having oil spills to, our competition. Uber has done a couple of big things where they got in a lot of trouble with customers and usually like paying clients because they weren't living up to the expectations of those customers, and it really hurts the bottom line of the business. So those big institutional investors not only care about the positive impacts that you're having, they also care about you mitigating the risk that could come from those negative things. So if you don't have any diversity in your leadership, for example, some investors do care about it for the right reasons, and some care because it's a potential PR risk. So I think there is still in the business world a big spectrum of people whose values and goals are in different places. But I think at the end of the day, it is about being cognizant, as I laid out, that when you're doing social impact social impact in the business world, you should be thinking about the actual social impact and what's driving you in that impact space, but then also how it does drive business bottom line, because that is what still matters to many investors. And the investor sector is changing, but slowly, and it's still about talking about it in the bottom line language.
Great. Well, thank you so much. In class, just on all that, we're going to do a great case study on Fiji Water and all their missteps and how they got excoriated for saying one thing and doing another. So it's a great case study. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today. I still see that you've kept the I in your first name. I'm waiting for that to change.
One day I'll change it.
That's when I know that you're all in on Lyft, is when, so that'll be great. You have any closing thoughts for us?
No, I think just, so great to meet all of you. Excited that you're thinking about and talking about corporate responsibility. I really think the next generation of corporate leaders and employees are already pushing, companies to do more, and you can push companies to do more. You can push investors to do more. So, the more we're talking about this, the more we'll slowly move the field in the way that I hope it is, so that we all have really ethical, great companies in the future that don't disappoint us and that live up to our values. So go do that and be those great players in the business field.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you so much for taking the time. I'll circle back around and thank you later in private as well. So thanks everybody for attending, and that's it. So thank you. Everybody have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.